Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 380. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Got a lot of news to cover on today's show, including the Great China Balloon Attack that happened over this past weekend that has everybody very concerned, but I'll be breaking it down, and it's not quite so big of a deal as most of the media is making it out to be. So with that, let's start with this article I wrote for antiwar.com on February 3rd. Amid concerns over a balloon, U.S. cancels high-level meeting with China. And so I did write this article before the U.S. shot down the balloon. But just as a quick update, the U.S. shot down the balloon with, I believe, an F-22 fighter jet over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of the Carolinas. So I write, after the Pentagon claimed there was a Beijing-operated surveillance balloon hovering over American skies, Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his plans to visit China next week. While the Department of Defense official told the media it has high confidence the unknown balloon is a Chinese-operated surveillance craft, it has no details on how the balloon reached or on how the Pentagon reached this conclusion. Beijing issued a statement saying the balloon is from China but merely a civilian weather balloon. On Thursday, American defense officials revealed to reporters the Department of Defense has tracked a balloon for several days in American skies. However, the Pentagon admitted Beijing would gain little from such a surveillance device, and this is from a U.S. official. First, our best assessment is that at the moment is that whatever the surveillance payload on this balloon is, it does not create significant value added over and above what the People's Republic of China is likely able to collect through such things as satellites in low Earth orbit, the official said. And this is, I think pretty common sense, what kind of technology they could stuff on a satellite now and how many satellites many of these defense departments have. It's not surprising at all that they wouldn't need a balloon to collect any kind of surveillance. So the Pentagon official added that the Pentagon did not shoot down the balloon, which is located in the skies above Montana, because falling debris could injure people on the ground. The DoD spokesperson, General Pat Ryder, said the balloon will not interfere with civilian aircraft and does not present a military threat. And so this is what the U.S. Pentagon is saying. And look, the Pentagon, their history is inflating threats. For those of you who have watched the other 379 episodes of this show, you know that most of the time what the Department of Defense will do is they tend to, inflate the threat, say that this is more of a problem than it is. And just by saying that it's a Chinese surveillance craft, they likely inflated this problem quite a bit. So, this then it turned into a huge thing, especially among the American right, which, the American left now really has their gun directed at Russia, where the right really has it directed at China. And so we saw, the likes of Jap Osibik, Mike Cernovich, and a lot of others coming out and really demanding war with China over this. A lot of congressmen saying that we have to shoot it down. Now, it sounded ridiculous to me that the U.S. couldn't find some place over American territory to, over Montana, a pretty rurally populated state, to shoot this thing. That just seemed kind of odd to me. Also seemed odd that they needed an F-22 to shoot this down. Now, I guess I'm curious as to what kind of, ammunition they fired and everything like that. But the whole way this played out from the Pentagon side, I thought was very curious. So the White House is reacting to the alleged Chinese craft by canceling a high-level diplomatic summit in Beijing. Had Blinken made the trip, he would have met with the Chinese foreign minister and potentially the Chinese president. A senior State Department spokesperson told reporters on Friday, after consultations with our interagency partners, as well as with Congress, we have concluded that conditions are not right at this moment for Secretary Blinken to travel to China. The U.S. is claiming that talks are postponed and will take place at a later date, but did not indicate when they will happen. And my suspicion is that, it'll be a long time before these talks happen, and they are essentially canceled if Blinken ends up meeting with his Chinese counterparts, that'll be almost a separate issue. Likely by the time it happens. China issued a statement on Friday saying the craft was a weather balloon intended for civilian scientific purposes. The airship comes from China and is of civilian nature, used for scientific research such as meteorology, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said. Beijing claims strong winds create a situation outside of its control that pushed the balloon into American airspace. Beijing said it regretted that the balloon drifted into American skies and called for it to be for talks to resolve the dispute. However, talks will now be less likely as the State Department is keeping its distance from China. Still, some in Congress are calling for more action. Senator Marco Rubio asserted the balloon was a Chinese surveillance craft that should have been shot down. It was a mistake not to shoot down the Chinese spy balloon when it was over a sparsely populated area. This is not some hot air balloon. It has a large payload of sensors, roughly the size of 2 city buses, and the ability to maneuver independently. So, Rubio and a lot of other people in Congress were trying to make it as big a deal as possible. Now, this net story from Dave DeCamp, I think is really interesting. This is February 5th. Pentagon says Chinese balloons have traveled over the U.S. before. When the Pentagon first announced the Chinese balloon was traveling in U.S. airspace, the official said similar instances have happened in the past, including at times before the Biden administration. On Saturday, a senior Pentagon official briefing reporters was more specific, saying it happened 3 times during the Trump administration and at least once under Biden. The official said that Chinese balloons transited the continental United States briefly at least 3 times during the prior administration, and once that we know of at the beginning of this administration, but never for this duration of time. Fox News reported that at least one Chinese balloon flew over Florida and Texas during the Trump administration, but President Trump and other former top officials in his administration strongly denied the claim. Later, an unnamed senior Biden administration official claimed to Fox that the balloons transit over the United States during the Trump administration were only discovered after he left office. They went undetected, the administration official said. So, I guess I'm pretty skeptical about this part of the story for a few reasons. One is, how were they able to go back and tell years later that these balloons traveled over the United States? That sounds suspicious. Also, it fits the narrative well if you're looking to combat what the Trump administration people have been saying about the Biden administration over the weekend. They're saying, oh, if this was under the Trump presidency, it would have been shot down right away. Well, this kind of cuts against this, saying, oh, well, these balloons flew over and you didn't shoot them down. So, some interesting dynamics there. Now, again, how they determine that these balloons have flown over before is interesting. And it doesn't seem like, if something flew over Texas or Florida, that would have spent quite as much time in American skies as this past one did. Now, back to Dave's article. The Pentagon claims the balloon was discovered over the U.S. last week, was designed for surveillance, while China insisted it was a weather balloon that accidentally drifted into U.S. and was only used for civilian purposes. An F-22 shot down the balloon on Saturday after it was over the ocean off the coast of South Carolina. A Chinese criticized as an obvious overreaction to a serious violation of international practice. Alleged foreign surveillance aircraft operating in the U.S. might not have raised any alarms before the Trump administration withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty in 2022. And, China and other countries are all a party to this. It was meant as a trust building measure between the U.S. and Russia during the Cold War, or I guess after the Cold War, since it was signed in 1992. But it was meant to help these countries feel more comfortable that that the nuclear treaties were being upheld and things like that. While it's not clear what the balloon was intended for, if it purposely flew over the U.S., there's a history of balloons being used for surveillance. In the 1950s, the U.S. launched hundreds of balloons, surveillance balloons over the Soviet Union and China, known as Project Generis. Today, satellite technology makes deploying such balloons unnecessary to collect military intelligence. However, Politico reported in 2022 that the U.S. was working on a new plan involving balloons to track hypersonic missiles. The report also said that in 2019, the Pentagon launched 25 balloons in a demonstration when considering to use them for drug traffickers. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled his trip to China after the presence of the balloon was announced. And so there's one more important thing, and that is, of course, in 2001, during the Bush administration, there was an American spy plane that collided with a Chinese craft in Chinese or near Chinese territory. And I think it killed a Chinese pilot. And, the U.S. used diplomacy to resolve that issue, but it doesn't seem like any of that's happening now. So, honestly, from my perspective, the biggest story here about the balloon is just what a mess the U.S. and particularly our media is right now, that we have, a relatively small object, and, we have thousands of warplanes, very advanced ships and everything, like missiles and all this kind of technology. And we have a balloon in our skies, and the American people are freaking out. They're terrified because our commentators go in front of us and just, constantly hype up the threat as much as possible. There's people talking about how this could be a precursor to a nuclear attack or something like that, when China only has a few hundred nukes, a small fraction, a small percentage of the American nuclear arsenal. And, they don't have their nuclear weapons deployed where we do. China launched a nuclear attack to the United States. We would absolutely obliterate China. And yet, people are just talking about how this could be a precursor to the nuclear attack with, no other information. So, next up, let's move on and talk about some really important stories on the war in Ukraine. This one I wrote for antiwar.com on the 3rd. Report: Biden pushed peace plan that recognized Russia's control over 20% of Ukraine. President Joe Biden dispatched his CIA director to Kiev with a proposal to end the war in Ukraine last month, according to the Swiss outlet NZZ. And this is a Swiss outlet, but it is a German language paper and is considered one of the papers of record in Switzerland. And they interview German officials here. So just, we're all unfamiliar with this outlet, but apparently it's a, pre-establishment outlet in Europe. The peace plan was offered at the same time the White House was preparing significant escalations in military support for Kiev, including announcing the U.S. will send Abrams tanks to Ukraine. The report cites high-level sources in Berlin who claimed CIA Director William Burns, the head of America's spy agency, traveled to Kiev in mid-January to meet with Ukrainian President Zelensky. On January 19th, the Washington Post reported that Burns recently traveled to Ukraine to meet with Zelensky. During the trip, Burns is said to have offered a deal to Zelensky wherein Ukraine would cede about 20% of its territory to Russia in exchange for Moscow ending its war in Ukraine. Now, NZZ's sources say that both Kiev and Moscow rejected the proposal. In a statement to Newsweek, the CIA denied Burns delivered the proposal. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov also dismissed the NZZ report, labeling it a canard. Now, I do think the Washington Post report is what gives this the most credibility, but I will break down, talk about some of the possibilities here, maybe what we don't know about this story once I finish my article. According to the German sources, the peace proposal reflects a growing rift in the White House on how to handle the war in Ukraine. Security advisor Jake Sullivan and Burns wanted to end the war quickly so they could focus on China. The report continued: on the other side would be Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. They do not want to get away with Russia destroying the rules-based peace order and called for massive military support for Ukraine. After Burns failed to sway Kiev and Moscow to agree to Washington's plan, Blinken and Austin were able to sway the president to authorize the transfer of Abrams tanks to Ukraine. NZZ reports the decision for the U.S. to send manned battle tanks to Ukraine caught the German leader Olaf Scholz off guard. The union in the German Bundestag, that's their parliament, issued a statement saying Schultz did not want to deliver until the very end because he has firmly assumed that the Americans would not send battle tanks either. Negotiations between Kiev and Moscow have stalled for nearly a year. Last March, Turkish diplomats facilitated talks that nearly ended the war, with Russian forces withdrawing from Ukrainian territory. Captured after the start of the invasion. However, then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson traveled to Kiev and told Zelensky that Ukraine's Western backers were not prepared to end the war. And if you remember, around the same time, we got very hawkish statements from Blinken and Austin, including Austin saying that, this war would allow the West to weaken Russia. And at the same time, we had Turkey, who was carrying out the diplomacy, saying that for some in NATO, and this was reported in the Washington Post as well, that for some in NATO, a protracted war was preferable to a quick settlement of this war because it would see Russia weakened more. And so, anyways, I think there are questions. It's fair to question the NZZ report, given that both Washington and the Kremlin denied it. However, I do think that, there must be some kind of split within the White House based on some of the statements that we get from Biden. He constantly says the U.S. isn't going to do things, and then the U.S. ends up doing it. I don't think, this is Biden playing 4D chess with the American people. I do see, some of that kind of rhetoric where they say, oh, Biden says we're not going to give tanks because everybody would be really upset about it. And so if he waits until, the Ukrainians are in trouble, then there's going to be less of a pushback or backlash. And that, those kind of things are certainly possible. But my guess is that, there are debates within the White House, and at times, they say, no, we're not going to give tanks. And then a different side wins the debate. And so the way this progressed and the other reporting around it based on who is going to give tanks and when does, I think, give some credibility to this NZZ report. And hopefully we get more details to come out in the future. Some people are asking, well, if this was a real offer, why didn't Russia accept it? And it may be that Russia, depending on what the 20% was, maybe they were looking for different lines or something like this was just the Donbass and not the southern regions of Ukraine, including the Sea of Azov in that area. Now we have another report here from Dave DeCamp, which is also huge. This is really breaking. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett says U.S. blocked his attempt to end a Russia-Ukraine peace deal. So, former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said in an interview posted on his YouTube channel on Saturday that the U.S. and its Western allies blocked his efforts of mediating a deal between Russia and Ukraine to bring an end to the war in the early days. On March 4th, 2022, Bennett traveled to Russia to meet with Putin. In the interview, he detailed the mediation at the time between Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky, which he said he coordinated with the US, France, Germany, and the UK. Bennett said that both sides agreed to major concessions during his mediation effort. For Russia's side, he said they dropped the denazification as a requirement for a ceasefire. Bennett defined denazification as the removal of Zelensky during his meeting in Moscow with Putin. Bennett said the Russian leader guaranteed that he wouldn't try to kill Zelensky. And so there are some interesting pieces here. I don't know if Western leaders were actually traveling to Ukraine up until this point. And so, it may be this agreement that made a leader like Boris Johnson feel a little bit more comfortable about traveling to Kiev to meet with Zelensky, where he ultimately deters Zelensky from negotiating with Russia and going through with the Turkish broker deal that was made later in March. But, it is interesting that this happens at the beginning of the month and we get those assurances. Now, Last year, in the first month of the war, I wanted to say, we are talking a lot about what Russia's demands meant, particularly around denazification. And we talked about at the time that, that might not have meant regime change. It might have meant that they really just wanted to get rid of the Azov battalion and the neo-Nazi elements within Ukraine's government. But it does seem like at least at one point that was directed at regime change. Which is interesting. And then, Putin agreeing not to carry out the assassination of Zelensky as well. The other concessions Russia made, according to Bennett, is that it wouldn't seek the disarmament of Ukraine. For Ukraine's side, Zelensky renounced that he would seek NATO membership, which Ben said was the reason for the Russian invasion. And again, we have another admission from a world leader about the start of this war and all the ways the West could have prevented the war. Of course, we have Merkel and Holland, I think most infamously, just saying that the Minsk agreement was a complete sham. They never intended to implement it, and it was all about buying Ukraine time to fight this war against Russia. And now, we have Bennett saying that not only were the Americans not interested in negotiation, but simply the cause for the war was Ukrainian membership in NATO, which the U.S. was never planning on giving NATO, and we've talked about that a lot in the past on the show as well. Discussing how Western media efforts leaders felt about his mediation efforts, Bennett said then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson took an aggressive line, while President of France Macron and German Chancellor Scholz were more pragmatic. Bennett said Biden adopted both positions, which, based on what we just talked about, isn't surprising. When asked if Western powers blocked the mediation efforts, Bennett said, basically, yes, they blocked it, and I thought they were wrong. Explaining his decision to mediate, Bennett said that it was Israel's national interest not to pick a side in the war. Citing Israel's frequent airstrikes in Syria, Bennett said Russia had S-300 air defenses in Syria, and if they press the buttons, Israeli pilots will fall. Negotiations between Russia and Ukraine didn't stop with Bennett's efforts. Later in March, Russia and Ukrainian officials met in Istanbul, Turkey, and followed up with virtual consultations. According to the account of a former U.S. official speaking with Foreign Affairs, the two sides agreed on a framework for a tentative deal. Russian officials, including Putin, have said that deals were close following the Istanbul talks, but negotiations ultimately failed after more Western pressure. Boris Johnson visited Kiev in April 2022, urging Zelensky not to negotiate with Russia. According to reports from Ukrainian Pravda, he even said that if Ukraine was ready to sign a deal with Russia, Kiev's Western backers were not. Later in April, Turkish foreign minister said that there were some NATO countries that wanted to prolong the war in Ukraine. After the talks in Istanbul, we did not think that the war would take this long, but following the NATO foreign ministers meeting, it was the impression that there are those within the NATO member states that want the war to continue. Let the war continue, and Russia gets weaker. They don't care much about the situation in Ukraine. And then a few days later, Austin made his speech where he said one of the U.S. goals in Ukraine was to see Russia weakened. And so now that we talk about how, the U.S. really doesn't want to end the war, we see how they are prolonging it still. New $2.2 billion arms package for Ukraine includes longer range rockets. And one of the things I want to talk about here is towards the end of the year, a lot of the arms packages going to Ukraine, they were announced weekly, but we're in the hundreds of millions and low hundreds of millions of dollars at that, where these arms packages are quite large. The recent ones this year have been multi-billion-dollar arms packages. The Biden administration on Friday announced a new $2.2 billion arms package for Ukraine that includes longer-range rockets, marking the first and latest escalation, although they won't be delivered until much later this year. The Boeing-made ground-launched small-diameter bombs GLSDB can hit targets up to 94 miles away, nearly twice the range of the munitions Ukraine is currently using with U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems. This gives them a longer range capability, long-range fire capabilities that will enable them, again, to conduct operations in defense of their country and to take back their sovereign territory in Russia-controlled areas, the Pentagon spokesperson said. The announcement comes after a series of other U.S. escalations, including pledges to provide M1 Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. Each step brings the U.S. and Russia closer to direct conflict. The U.S. is providing the GLSDBs through the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows for the U.S. to purchase arms on behalf of Ukraine. Weapons provided under USAI could take months or years to deliver, as they involve contracts that might need to be manufactured. The new munition is made up of precision-guided bombs and M26 rocket motors. Boeing has been pushing the U.S. to provide Ukraine with the weapons, and since the M26 motors are widely available in U.S. military stockpiles. According to Politico, the U.S. military doesn't have any ground-launched versions of the bomb in its stockpiles, and it could take 9 months to make the necessary retrofits. It's also important to note that the Pentagon said in the past that these weapons would be redundant. The massive new $2.2 billion package is broken down into $1.75 in USAI funds and $425 million for the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows the U.S. to send arms directly from Pentagon stockpiles. So in the Presidential Drawdown Authority, we're going to have ammunition for HIMARS, ammunition for 155 millimeter and 125 millimeter artillery and mortar rounds, 190 heavy machine guns with thermal imagery sights and associated ammunition to counter unmanned aerial surveillance, 181 mine resistance ambush patrol or MRAP vehicles, 250 Javelin anti-armor systems, 2,000 anti-armor rockets, Claymore mines, demolition munitions, cold weather gear, helmets, and other field equipment. And then this is what's coming through USAI: 2 Hawk air defense firing units, anti-aircraft guns and ammunition, equipment to integrate Western air defense launchers, missiles, and radars with Ukraine's air defense systems, equipment to sustain Ukraine's existing air defense capabilities, air defense generators, counter unmanned aerial systems, 4 air surveillance radars, 20 counter mortar radars, spare parts for counter artillery radars, Puma unmanned aerial systems, precision guided rockets, secure communications equipment, medical supplies, funding for training, maintenance, and sustainment. The Pentagon also put out a fact sheet on Friday detailing U.S. military aid to Ukraine since the Russia invasion. According to the fact sheet, the U.S. has pledged $29.3 billion in military equipment alone since February 24th, 2022. So all this is aimed, of course, they say, at helping Ukraine retake its sovereign territory, but we have this very important mission. Pentagon tells lawmakers Ukraine unlikely to retake Crimea. Senior Pentagon officials told lawmakers in the House Armed Services Committee last week in a classified briefing that the Ukraine is unlikely to retake Crimea from Russia, Politico reported on Wednesday. The briefing reflects other recent reporting that the U.S. officials don't think Ukraine has the capability to take the peninsula, which Russia has controlled since 2014. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, said back in November that the probability of Ukraine kicking Russia out of the territory it captured since last February and Crimea is not high. Milley reiterated his point on January 20th. I maintain that for this year, it would be very, very difficult for the military to eject Russia forces from every inch of Ukraine and occupied or Russian occupied Ukraine. According to the Politico report, the Ukrainian government was furious with Milley's comments. Ukrainian officials maintain that kicking Russia out of Crimea is still one of their war goals, although Ukraine is beginning to lose more territory in its battle against Russian forces in the east. Representative Mike Rogers, he's a Republican from Alabama, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, declined to discuss the comments of the briefing his panel received on Crimea, but signaled the U.S. might be looking to wind down the war. According to Politico, Rogers said the war needs to end this summer and said that the U.S. must rapidly supply Kiev for a coming offensive. He also indicated that the U.S. might try to pressure the government of Ukraine to have more realistic idea of victory, and said that Russia is never going to quit and give up Crimea. What is doable, and I don't think that it's agreed upon yet, so I think that there is going to have to be some pressure from our government and NATO leaders with Zelensky about what does victory look like. Rogers added, I think it's going to help now more than anything to be able to drive Putin and Zelensky to the table and end this thing this summer. But a lot could happen between now and the summer. The U.S. and its NATO allies continue to announce major escalations of military aid, and a direct clash between NATO and Russia becomes more likely. And so while, we have some comments from some high-ranking American officials sounding more sane on the issue, it does seem within the White House the Hawks are, gaining the upper hand with the recent escalations. Next up, Zelensky warns major Russian offensive is coming. Ukraine's defense minister claims Russia has amassed 500,000 troops. Ukraine's President Zelensky on Thursday warned Russia is amassing troops and that a major Russian offensive coming. And now Russia is concentrating its forces. We all know that it's preparing to take revenge not only against Ukraine but against Europe and the free world, Zelensky said alongside the European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen, who was in Kiev ahead of the EU summit in the city. I think she pledged like 38 billion light bulbs to Ukraine or something absurd like that. Russian winter offensives has been expected in Moscow, has reinforced its position since it mobilized 300,000 fresh troops. Ukraine's defense minister claimed that the Russian troop buildup consists of 500,000 troops. Officially, they announced 300,000, but when we see the troops at our borders, according to our assessment, it's much more. While Russia has yet to launch a major offensive, Russia and Ukrainian forces have continued to battle it out in the eastern Donbass region, mainly around the Donetsk region of Bakhmut. Russian forces have been making gains around the city, and U.S. and other Western officials have acknowledged that Ukrainian forces have been taking heavy losses in the battle. We had a Russian official saying that Ukraine was suffering a 3-digit number of losses a day. Now, this is a huge story, and it's buried way down on this show because of all the other really important news that we had to get to. But Germany opened to theories that a Western country attacked the Nord Stream pipeline. This has been coming. Now, I never suspected on this show that Russia at all was behind it. Didn't make sense. I said that from day one. My point was I wasn't sure that it was the White House, just given the climate impacts. I think this was the largest methane leak in history when this pipeline was destroyed. I don't know if the White House would carry out something like this. Is an act of terrorism. It's economic terrorism, full stop. There's no way to deny that. Had Russia done something like this, the Western countries would have lost their mind. But they've had to admit that there's no evidence that Russia was behind this. This is, I think, the Washington Post had 23 officials from a handful of Western countries, all saying that there's no evidence that it was Russia. Germany, Sweden, and Denmark have all carried out investigations. They have no evidence that it was Russia. And now Germany is coming out and saying, well, maybe it was a Western country. My first guess is actually the UK, and my second guess is Poland at this point. I think those are the most likely culprits. Now, the bigger issue here almost than the pipeline being destroyed. Because remember, the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline wasn't even carrying gas, and the other one was essentially turned off at the time. It is that, they thought this would really escalate tensions between the West and Moscow. And so, there are people within Western governments, within NATO governments, that are willing to carry out attacks on infrastructure to attempt to blame it on Russia, to potentially start a nuclear war between the world's two largest nuclear superpowers. I mean, this is really, really dangerous. The way that this has all been handled and everything. So very concerning. Last up, real quick, Ukraine to replace defense minister after corruption scandal. So Ukraine's a very corrupt country. No surprise the defense minister gets tied up in this. Now, it's unclear that if, I do wonder maybe the defense minister is being removed a little bit because there's not it's not going so well for the Ukrainian forces right now. They're losing a lot of troops. They're losing territory. And so it could also be a power grab by Zelensky. It could also be just, they're trying to show that they're making changes in an effort to get European Union or NATO membership. The European Union is meeting in Ukraine this week. And so firing corrupt officials could try to be assigned to the European partners from Ukraine that, hey, we're ready to join your ranks. Now, hopefully they don't buy that, because there's a lot more to resolving corruption than just, firing some corrupt people. You actually had to put non-corrupt people in their place, but we'll see what happens. Anyways, thank you all so much for tuning into the show today. I'll be back with more shows later in the week.